Hello, I'm Dr. Pauline Mackay, the lecturer in Robert Burns Studies at the University of Glasgow's Centre for Robert Burns Studies. Because of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the Centre for Robert Burns Studies and the National Trust for Scotland's Robert Burns Birthplace Museum are unable to host our annual Sellout Burns Conference in January 2021. We do, however, want to bring you one of the conference's annual fixtures online, the Burns Scotland Lecture. Burns Scotland is the national Burns collection, comprised of local authorities, national institutions and incorporating the University of Glasgow, with holdings of manuscripts, objects and indeed properties associated with the Scottish National Bard. Who better to give the Burns Scotland Lecture this year than a friend and collaborator of both the Centre for Robert Burns Studies and the Robert Burns Birthplace Museum, Dr. David Hopes. David was instrumental in the redevelopment of the birthplace prior to its reopening in 2010. He was the director of the birthplace for a number of years and is now the head of interiors and collections for the National Trust for Scotland. His lecture this year is on the birth of a museum, the Burns Monument Trust and the formation of Scotland's first literary museum, 1814 to 1900. I'm going to pass you briefly on to my colleagues down at the birthplace so that they can send you their best wishes. But once you've heard David's excellent lecture, there will be an opportunity to join David, myself, and Christopher Waddell, the learning manager at the birthplace, for a live question and answer session on Sunday the 24th of January 2021 at 6:30 p.m. GMT. Please do join us with any questions that you have about David's lecture or indeed about Robert Burns and his birthplace in Alloway in Ayrshire. I look forward to seeing you at the live session, and in the meantime I hope that you enjoy this excellent talk.
Hello folks, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Chris Waddell and I'm the learning manager here at the National Trust for Scotland's Robert Burns Birthplace Museum. For several years now, we've worked closely with our friends and colleagues from the Centre for Robert Burns Studies to host the annual Burns Conference right here at the museum in Alloway. Sadly, of course, this isn't possible this year. The conference has, like so many other things, fallen victim to the COVID pandemic. However, we couldn't allow January 2021 to pass and not do anything. So we're working once again in partnership with the team from the Centre for Robert Burns Studies to bring you this online substitute. I do hope you enjoy it. Meanwhile, stay safe folks. Celebrate Burns season as best you can among friends and family at home. And let's all look forward to 2022, when I'm sure we can all meet up again, shake hands and celebrate our bard once again in the appropriate fashion. All the very best, and please take care.
Hello, delighted to be invited to deliver this year's Burns Scotland lecture, and I'd like to speak about the formation of Scotland's first literary museum and the creation of the most significant collection about Burns in the world, that now cared for by Robert Burns Birthplace Museum. A special thanks to Chris Waddell and CRBS for their help and support in putting together this paper. It's the story of how a small elite group set about creating a monument in stone, but who would eventually find themselves in the museum business. How did this happen? Well, the evidence suggests, I think, that this process of museumization was gradual and happened in three broad phases, which I've called conservatism, revisionism, and finally expansionism. But perhaps more importantly, why did this evolution happen? Burns Monument Trust, the organisation set up to commemorate Burns, found that their ability to manage the reputation of Burns was enhanced by meeting a public demand for the authentic, rather than seeking to screen this from view. This not only gave them a means to sustain the memory of Burns, but also a form of cultural capital and respect, which a classical building alone could not do. However, in responding to this demand, they did not lose sight of their original mission as reputational watchdogs for Burns. So let's get started. There we go. Let's take a look at the first phase of development, characterised by social and cultural conservatism. Stimulated by the movement to create a tasteful tomb more worthy of Burns's posthumous fame in the town where he was buried, we can see in the slide here Burns' mausoleum, Dumfries, which was completed in 1817. In March 1814, 5 Ayrshire gentlemen formed a committee which would become Burns Monument Trust, chaired by Sir Alexander Boswell, 1st Baronet of Auchinleck, who set about memorialising Burns in Alloway, the place of his birth. This is the first page of the minutes of Burns Monument Trust, and it records that while a committee of gentlemen of Dumfriesshire are exerting themselves in a manner honourable to their spirit and their feelings, in erecting a mausoleum over the grave of Robert Burns, it must be no less an interesting object with us to raise a monument to the memory of the Ayrshire bard where he first drew breath, and in that county where his genius was fostered and matured, and therefore that a monument shall be erected at or near the place of his birth. And there can be little doubt of the anxiety of all ranks to offer tributes to the memory of Burns. Although all ranks were no doubt anxious to pay tribute to Burns, the Monument Committee was dominated by local aristocrats, landowners and officials who had their own sense of Burns's merits and his place in the social order. From the outset, the Monument project was inherently conservative. It sought to direct attention towards Burns's virtues and the Trust's own particular worldview, rather than what was perceived to be his frailties and follies. To do this, they needed to put a distance between the two. But before we look at how the Trust did this, why was there any need for any form of virtue signalling? Burns's early death had precipitated a sense of national loss, but also scandal and injustice. His reputation had suffered harm from James Currie's blistering biography, published in 1800 and reprinted 7 times within 20 years. In it, the poet was castigated for, among other things, heavy drinking and the conversion of the poet's birthplace in the late 18th century to a public house, which you can see here, only perpetuated the connection between Burns and drink in the public consciousness. In 1810, the Irish politician and wit John Philpot Curran visited Burns' cottage and wrote, "The genius and fate of the man, i.e. Burns, were already heavy on my heart, but the drunken laugh of the landlord gave me such a view of the rock in which he founded, I could not stand it, but burst into tears." Speeches about Burns in Alloway at the time echo Currie's sententiousness, so much that the Mechanics magazine noted, "It is too customary to end with allusions to frailties and follies with which obloquy loves to heap his name. It is for us to draw a veil over his errors." This led to an ambivalence at the heart of the project to build a monument to Burns. Pride in his achievements and where he was from, combined with embarrassment and shame about aspects of his adult life, and also a sense of injustice. There's a great deal of anger directed towards the ruling classes and what many perceived to be the gross injustice which Burns had experienced during his lifetime. On a visit to Alloway in 1843, Julian Harvey, the Chartist academic, acknowledged the magnificence of Burns' monument, but thought that it stood in sharp contrast to Burns's pecuniary situation at his death, and suspected that visitors would regard this cold stone pile a monument to the meanness as well as pride of this Scottish aristocracy. Burns's memory was heavily contested both locally and nationally, and the monument movement brought these tensions bubbling to the surface. So how did the committee chart a course through this moral minefield? The wording of their first minute is telling. They intend siting the monument at or near his birthplace. Now, the committee considered the actual birthplace, which is marked by Burns Cottage, of course, as one of 3 sites for a monument, shown here on the left-hand side in a survey from the time. But given the cottage's associations with drink, which they had regarded as an affront to the memory of Burns and at odds with the picture Burns had painted of virtuous peasant life in his poem Because Saturday Night, they dismissed it in favour of a romantic location overlooking Brigadoon and Alloway Old Kirk, but within sight of the cottage. This instigated what Alexander Boswell, the chair of Burns Monument Trust, called a paper war with the incorporation of shoemakers of Ayr, who owned the cottage at the time, who set about raising subscriptions for their own Burns Hall, which they pointed out, unlike the monument, would include accommodation for Burns admirers and artifacts. This public advertisement on the right-hand side highlights what many perceived to be the inadequacies of the monument, even at design phase, but also the fact that the notion of collecting material culture associated with Burns was not an alien concept, even in the 1820s. The committee's choice of sites was the earliest overt expression of their attempt to strictly manage the reputation of Burns. The committee added further distance from the cottage by opting for a grand classical design for the monument, as shown in this early watercolour. Whilst the vernacular birthplace symbolised mortality and rusticity, the incorporation's advertisement even accepted that the building must soon decay. The choice of a Greek revival style for the monument connoted immortality and the non-local. In many ways, the cottage and monument were pitted as opposites. The classical design a statement of who Burns was now, not what he had come from. Although the committee gave the architect Thomas Hamilton scope for his taste and fancy, it is clear from the surviving correspondence that they influenced the design. One of the many design changes the committee insisted upon was the replacement of Ionic for Corinthian capitals, as we can see here in the watercolour, the latter being aesthetic signifiers for the classical virtues of purity and beauty, something which trustees clearly wanted writ large in the towering 9 columns, each 30 feet in height. It was a structure designed to encapsulate the ambivalence and taste of its instigators. It had just enough vernacularity to plant Burns in his native soil, but the dominant feature was the superstructure representing Burns's achievements and his place among the immortals. As one commentator noted, the graceful proportions of the monument direct attention to Burns's virtues, not his follies. Its rusticated 3-sided local red sandstone base was intended to represent the 3 ancient divisions of Ayrshire from which Burns came. This is surmounted by grey crately sandstone used in the construction of much of Edinburgh's New Town, symbolising the refinement of Burns's genius and his immortality, his place among the gods. In his design, Hamilton borrowed from the Cottage monument of Lysicrates in Athens, pictured here, as well as Rome's Temple of Jupiter Stator. Overall, the building said as much about the committee as Burns. Like the Cottage monument in Athens, on which it was modelled, it portrayed the trust as patrons of the arts. It was a grand exercise in reflecting and influencing taste. The monument's conspicuousness and command of the surrounding landscape, for example, landmarks in the life of and work of Burns were viewable from its parapet. This was a key feature. It was primarily designed as a romantic spectacle, connecting directly with the landscape, unlike Hamilton's Edinburgh Burns Monument, completed in 1831, which allowed no open views of nature and claimed Burns instead as an Enlightenment poet. The structure's sentimental effect to reflect the spirit and feelings was paramount, and this would be an important factor in how the interior was utilised in memorialisation of Burns. The interior of the monument recreated a Greek temple with allusions to immortality, masculinity, sacrifice, and achievement, using Greek meander decoration, which we can see in the upper right-hand side here, Ukrainia, lower right-hand side, circularity, connoting eternity, laurel wreaths, and so on. But there's no evidence that it was ever intended as a space for display beyond statuary. It is appropriate for a building designed to project a certain image of Burns that during its first decade, the only items added to the interior were a preferred and idealised likeness of Burns and tasteful art inspired by his work. The pragmatics of display most probably played a role in this too. A small, unheated, circular room with curving stone walls may have proved effective in symbolising eternity and immortality, but was not ideally suited to picture hanging and the display of sensitive material. There were issues with weatherproofing from the outset until at least the 1860s, and indeed they continue to the present day. However, we do know that a coloured print, portrait of Burns by Mr. Stevens, after the first popular portrait of the poet by Alexander Nasmyth, which was printed by Maxwell Dick of Irvine, probably the first acquisition by the committee, since it was said to have served as the basis for a bust by the sculptor James Thom in 1858. And this may well be the very picture shown in the slide here. This was accompanied in the early 1830s by sketches inspired by Burns's work, also printed by Maxwell Dick, and other items which were tantalizingly described as merely items of less moment. More research is needed. Under the direction of David All, the custodian of the monument and grounds and owner of nearby Dounbrae Cottage and the Burns Inn, the aforementioned Tom went on to create life-size sandstone statues of Tam O'Shanter and Sir Johnny, which were exhibited in Glasgow, Edinburgh and London, before being gifted to the committee with a sum for their exhibition. Tom captured Tam and Johnny in high spirits at the beginning of Burns's poem Tam O'Shanter, and his attention to detail and warmth struck a chord with the Victorian public. The monument enclosure was enlarged by an acre in 1833 to exhibit the stone figures in a tasteful grotto at a short distance from the monument towards Brigadoon. Arguably, these were less an addition to the monument and more a complement to tea grounds also belonging to Auld in the adjacent Burns Inn, which included a shell palace. However, the realisation of these fictitious characters, adored by the Victorian public, although exhibited at a physical remove from the monument, fitted with the intention of Burns Monument Trust to commemorate not only the birth of Burns, but his genius. They were also a manifestation of an appetite for text-free tourism, and their folksy appeal provided a counterbalance to the classical stiffness of the monument. For the carefully managed monument, the Tom figures were not quite a change of direction, but something of a Trojan horse. They conveyed a sense of what the public expected and were a taste of things to come. In the 1840s, two major gifts to the committee were sufficiently important to go on display inside the monument. The first was corporeal and emotionally charged. Two small volumes of the Bible, the Holy Bible, with inscriptions by Burns and a lock of Highland Mary Campbell's hair, were repatriated from Canada in 1840 and donated to the committee in January 1841. These books, one volume and a lock of hair shown in the slide, were said to have been gifted from Burns to Campbell on their last meeting with a betrothal promise, which, with the death of Campbell shortly afterwards, was tragically unrealised. These were romantic objects for a romantic location, and the Victorian public gushed over them. 3 years later, the sculptor Patrick Park attended a major festival in and around the monument, and noting the absence of statuary, created a bust of Burns in the guise of a new comedy Greek poet. A perfect fit for the empty niche in the north end of the monument chamber, for which it was no doubt stylised. Statuary was always intended for outside and inside the monument. This was certainly the case for Hamilton's Edinburgh monument to Burns, designed to house John Flaxman's statue of Burns, created in 1828. But the move to include highly biographical artefacts from the adult life of the poet within the monument was a risky strategy, drawing attention to the poet's complicated love life. However, the sentimental pull of this gift and a likeness of Burns which matched the classical aspirations of its founders may have overcome such reservations. These two objects and a small number of books and artwork gave the inner monument an extra dimension. Although the committee were still responders to donations rather than overt collectors, they had given what was essentially an abstract hollow memorial corporeal presence and created a powerfully intimate experience within the monument. They had transitioned from memento mori to memento vitae. There is evidence that displaying personal artifacts was having a powerful effect on visitors. In a letter about his visit to the monument in 1846, the American writer, orator, and activist Frederick Douglas described the effect of seeing the bust and the Bibles. As I gazed on the hair of her he so dearly loved, and who by death was snatched from his bosom, and up to the bust glowing with expression, I received a vivid impression. Douglas went on to quote the words of Burns' song, "Ye banks and braes of Bonnie Doon," the object intensifying the sense of location and vice versa. Without knowing it, Burns Monument Trust had struck gold, and Burns's private life had become public property. The emotional authenticity offered by objects in an era of romantic tourism had given the monument project a new lease of life. Around the same time, there is evidence to suggest a change in Burns's reputation, which supported softer scrutiny of this kind. By virtue of the length of time which had elapsed since his death, Burns was becoming an historical figure rather than a contemporary one. Also, the number of biographies had risen sharply from the late 1820s, providing alternative perspectives on the poet, for example, biographies by Lockhart, Carlyle, and Cunningham. And politically, there was a growing liberal spirit about which Scottish Conservatives were in despair. This general climate then challenged the conservatism and cultural authority of Burns Monument Trust and their approach to stage managing the reputation of Burns through censorship of the cenotaph they had built. In a speech in Alloway at the Burns Festival in 1844, in this rather fine work, which is on display in RBBM, staunchly Tory Professor John Wilson said, "The fame of Burns is now mature, and the world, proud of his genius and sympathising in his sufferings, looks with indulgence on his eccentricities and errors." This suggests a change in how Burns's weaknesses were perceived. Indeed, Frederick Douglas also reflected on his visit to Alloway that Burns's very weakness was an index of his strength. This weakness then was increasingly regarded by Burns Monument Trust as a strength, given the impact of more intimate mementos of Burns's life. The tide was turning. There was a growing market across the British Isles, indeed, for sensory markers that evoked strong intimations in museum going from the mid to late 19th century among the middle classes, particularly with places closely associated with nation building, sites which combined heroic individuals and literature, such as the homes and haunts of Burns and Shakespeare. We can see blocks of hair from the head of Shakespeare, reputedly, and on the right-hand side, and some hair samples from the head of Burns and his wife Jean Armour on the left-hand side. There was a desire for sentimentality generally, and that affected Alloway. There was a shift in public interest in Burns's life as it went under the microscope, and artifacts like this provided scope for erratic encounters, which heightened the sentimental effect of the monument itself. To complement this engagement with individual items and to satisfy increasing numbers of visitors, following the opening of the railway from Glasgow to Ayr in 1840, Burns Monument Trust began to sell relic objects in great numbers. By 1881, the sale of souvenir woodwork, mostly Mauchlinware like this Mauchlinware covered book, badged bought in the monument or more prized, made from the fabric of Burns's many homes, buildings or items like the trysting thorn mentioned in his work or wood grown in the vicinity, accounted for as much profit for the trust as admissions did. The ritualization of the visit held true for what was left behind as well as what was taken. Throughout the 19th century, there are reports of the extent of graffiti on furniture and fittings in Burns Cottage as visitors carved their names on tables, chairs, doors, and window panes. These acts of appropriation through ritual marking and the trade in saleable relic artifacts reflects a growing democratization in remembering Burns through pilgrimage day tripping, and facilitating this helped to fuel the Trust's ambitions in Alloway. The maturing of Burns's reputation and the centenary of the poet's birth in 1859 may have been the reason for an increase in the number and variety of artifacts gathered by the committee in the 1840s and 1850s. First inventory of artifacts, seen here on the left-hand side, is recorded in the Trust minutes in 1868, and the earliest known photograph, shown on the right-hand side, probably taken before the inventory was captured, shows how they were laid out for visitors. Both snapshots demonstrate that by this stage, there are signs that the assemblage was being shaped and displayed purposefully. It had become a collection. The inventory lists 39 artefacts across 2 display venues, the monument and the statue house. It includes art, paraphernalia, books, manuscripts, artefacts which relate to drinking, such as a luggy or drinking vessel, as well as some odd acquisitions, such as a fancy box with glass lid, suggesting the monument was prone to unfocused collect. The Trust collection of books included first editions, Kilmarnock and Edinburgh, 3 foreign translations, French and German, biographies of Burns, multiple copies of Curry, a reminder of the conservatism of the early Trust, as well as more recent studies by Lockhart Cunningham, collected letters of the poet, and books which relate to Burns' tourism. This suggests a broad interest in Burns' life and work, but also an awareness of Burns' studies and the Burns cult, and a self-consciousness about the Trust's place in this. The positioning of artefacts on a table in the centre of the room and Park's likeness of Burns framed in the niche is a reminder of the building's Grecian temple design. In 1820, Alexander Boswell had likened the monument to a piled cairn where each man casts a stone, and certainly the verticality of the display cases set on the table, presumably to distinguish items of importance. The lock of hair is in a separate glass dome, flanked by the Highland Mary Bibles, resembled votive offerings piled high. The poet's wife's wedding ring was also present by 1870. This was an odd juxtaposition given the background to the lock of Mary's hair, but it was new territory for the Trust and an indicator of how far public interest and acceptability had come in almost 50 years since opening. The 1878 inventory also shows that the Trust had acquired the apparatus of the museum: 2 glass cases, a safe, a stove for heating, chairs for visitors, and a table on which to place artifacts. The monument was becoming domesticated and organised as more visitors registered their approval. This set the model for other memory sites, such as the Kilmarnock Burns Monument, designed by R.S. Ingram and completed in 1879, which included a purpose-built museum compartment from the outset, and other hero buildings of the period, such as Stirling's Wallace Monument, completed in 1869, and the National Burns Monument, Mauchline, 1898, both of which had exhibition areas, as well as the addition of further sculptures and artefacts to the Scott Monument in Edinburgh from the 1870s. Correspondence in the Robert Burns Birthplace Museum archive shows that by the 1860s, Burns Monument Trust was still struggling with the environment within the monument, but that they were object hungry and ambitious. In 1868, the Trust decided to levy a charge on admission, a reflection of increased running costs, which included the construction of an on-site keeper's house, completed in 1870, and a more professional, higher value offer. The Trust discussed tactics in pursuing significant pieces such as Naismith's portrait and the Burns Family Bible in the face of competition from other sites such as Burns Monument in Edinburgh and a rival exhibition hall at Burns Cottage, which opened in 1847. And you can just see the hall on the left-hand side of this early postcard. In 1868, relics at Burns Cottage, owned still by the Incorporation of Shoemakers of Ayr, were valued at £100. And 10 years later, the curators, as they were called, made a plea for rare editions to form a library in the hall at the back of the cottage. So there was already a rival exhibition area within Alloway, and indeed the corporation regarded themselves as collectors, rival collectors. By the 1870s, Burns Monument Trust was in a stronger financial position, and it made its boldest move yet in reputational management through Burns Real Estate. In the spirit of competition and expansionism, in 1879, the Secretary of Burns Monument Trust was instructed to ascertain if the cottage in which Burns was born was likely to be for sale. This would mark the beginning of a new, bolder phase of collecting and museumization, which included the largest artifact associated with the life of Burns, his birthplace. Negotiations with the Incorporation of Shoemakers of Ayr to acquire Burns Cottage were successfully advanced in 1880, and it is clear from that a major driver for the Trust was still the running sore of the licensing of the poet's birthplace. When asked his view on the potential acquisition, Secretary and Treasurer W.H. Dunlop stated, "Personally, I'm all in favour of acquiring Burns Cottage, if only that it may no longer exist as a public house." The transition from public house to public museum was settled by Whitsunday 1881, and in the Trust's first under new management advertisement poster, which we can see in the slide here, they highlighted that as well as a temperance refreshment room, collection of Burns relics, including very valuable holograph manuscripts of the poet, is being formed in the cottage. This is the first overt public announcement by the Trust acknowledging themselves as collectors. From their experience at the monument, they knew that this was not only a draw for serious-minded Burnsians, but also for general visitors too, and they needed lots of the latter. The move to purchase the cottage for £4,000 stretched the Trust, who borrowed 5 times the value of their reserves, against the security of an anticipated return through admissions income and the sale of woodwork. To do this, they needed to make the most of what they had, and they strongly encouraged visitors to visit the interior of the cottage to help them in liquidating the debt. An interesting and surely deliberate choice of words, given the recent removal of the drinks license, which had made the cottage financially viable. In repaying the debt to Burns, visitors were asked to do this by venerating the building's interior and its contents, as well as its exterior. Although rehabilitating Burns's reputation was a powerful motive for acquisition, the Trust also emphasised the importance of preservation, and this would figure much more as the pretext for their collecting activity over the next few decades. The first symbolic act of the new owners was to remove the licence to sell alcohol before demolishing modern additions to the cottage known to Burns, and the restoration of the buyer to make the cottage similar to what it had been before Burns had left it. The Trust set about this surgery with care and confidence. The Trust also acquired furniture and period pieces to dress rooms, including a large spinning wheel reputed to have belonged to Highland Mary. This image dates from 1878. So it would have been acquired by the Trust when they took over 3 years later. Perhaps they were seeking to replicate the effect of the Bibles in the monument by retaining objects such as this. Returning the cottage to its original appearance and utilising the cottage as a display space gave it kudos to potential donors and granted the Trust an unprecedented degree of cultural authority and respect. In 1885, the sculptor to Her Majesty the Queen, Sir John Steele, received 10 guineas from the Trust for the original model of the bust of Burns, which he had executed for Westminster Abbey, seen here. In thanking the trustees, Steele expressed his views on the significance of displaying within the cottage. Allow me again to say how deeply I feel the gratification that my original model of our nation's great and much loved bard has found a home in the cottage in which he actually lived. Similarly, in 1891, the Trust acknowledged the gift of an elaborate chair made from the printing press which produced Burns's first book, guaranteeing that it would be most carefully preserved in the cottage. The Trust's investments appeared to be paying off. At a meeting in November 1891, the minutes record that trustees expressed their satisfaction at the great success that followed their acquisition of the cottage, and which was much greater than had ever been anticipated. About 24,000 visitors had last year visited the cottage and 37,000 the monument. In fact, by 1881, or between 1881 and 1900, visitor numbers at Burns Monument doubled, while those at Burns Cottage tripled, demonstrating the effect ownership of both sites had on the Trust's reach. In 1895, given the Trust's healthy finances, they decided it would be expedient as opportunity offered and out of surplus income to purchase any genuine relic that might be for sale, and appointed a committee with powers to do so. Having a war chest and a subcommittee to move quickly should items become available heralded a new era of collecting for the Trust. The new acquisitions were split between the monument and cottage, but such was the Trust's success. There was soon real pressure on display space in the parlour and kitchen. At this stage, the curator was living in the byre and barn, and the monument chamber itself was filled to capacity. Added to this, following the explosion of a boiler in the smithy next door, which damaged the northern gable of the cottage in 1888, and a fire in the nearby woodyard in 1894, the Trust was worried about the risk of fire in the thatched cottage and set about building a separate museum, which included an exhibition room and a custodian's house, heated by water pipes adjacent to the cottage. We can just see that in this early postcard. The new museum building running at a right angle to Burns Cottage. This is now the Learning Pavilion, incidentally. By the 20th of September 1900, this brand new purpose-built museum was ready and would propel the Trust to embark upon a whole new pace of collecting. A few years before, the Trust refused a loan request from the Burns Federation, explaining that upon public grounds, such an application could not be entertained. Very many thousands annually during these months visiting the monument and cottage for the purpose of seeing these relics, and also on account of risk or loss or injury to the relics. The collection had become as big a draw as the monument and the cottage. The interiors of these buildings, like the interior life of Burns, had become an integral part of the visit and an important aspect of the mission of Burns Monument Trust. Therefore, what began as a moral crusade for the monumentalists of Alloway had become something more complex. There was a change of focus from the presentation of an idealized image of the poet and his immortality. The preservation of the poet's mortal remains. The tension which had characterized the early monument movement and its drive to create a monolithic architectural and controlled social statement about Burns had been resolved through a growing appreciation of what a diverse array of artifacts had to say about Burns and the dependence of Burns Monument Trust on visitor income. The Trust found that in responding to public interest in the poet's life, warts and all, they could gather cultural capital as well as things. This would ultimately lead to putting right of reputational wrongs through the acquisition and museumization of Burns Cottage. In doing so, at the turn of the 20th century, the Monument Trust was well placed to begin owning the whole story of Burns. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much to David for that fascinating talk. I hope that you all enjoyed it as much as I did. And of course, you can join David for a live question and answer session on Sunday the 24th of January 2021 at 6:30 p.m. Details of that will be made available on the Centre for Robert Burns Studies website and social media. And you can find us on Twitter at Glasgow Burns. Work is, of course, ongoing at the Centre for Robert Burns Studies to produce world-leading research on the Scottish National Bard, and a series of forthcoming publications will hopefully see our followers through until we can resume our usual schedule of symposia and conferences. I've recently published Burns for Every Day of the Year from Black and White Publishing. In February, a volume called Performing Burns, edited by Gerard Carruthers and Ian Brown, will be published by Edinburgh University Press. And also from EUP, we will see the first publication of the Burns Chronicle from its new home, and that will appear in spring of 2021. Last, but by no means least, we are looking forward to the publication of the 4th volume of our major edition of the works of Robert Burns for Oxford University Press, and that is Professor Kirsty McHugh's Songs for George Thompson, produced as part of the Editing Robert Burns for the 21st Century project. There will be a series of social media and press around the release of that volume, so we will make sure that you do not miss it. Finally, although we can't all come together to celebrate Burns Night this year, we'll hopefully all be taking part in more intimate celebrations in our own homes. And for that reason, we're inviting you to take part in a virtual celebration of the Bard by taking a photograph of your celebration, sending it to us, and using the hashtag #VirtualBurnsNight. This is part of a major project to document the Burns Supper, much of which will be revealed over the course of the coming days. So for now, thank you very much for your time, and as I've said, please do join us for the live question and answer and enjoy the outputs of the research from CRBS until we can hold our symposia and conferences again in 2021-22.